Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Boris Johnson may already have notched up some kind of record in his short time as Prime Minister. A 100% losing streak in the Houses of Parliament. A straight 6 out of 6 votes in 5 days. One of tonight's was awkward to say the least. He will now have to publish all emails and messages exchanged between his officials and advisers, including the somewhat controversial Dominic Cummings, on the decision to suspend Parliament. Except some of those same officials said tonight he has absolutely no intention of complying, which presumably means yet another court case. If this is taking back control, it's not clear who is and of what, but never mind. And to add to the day's excitements, the Speaker announced he was resigning in a tearful farewell, but not until after October the 31st. The question now, though, as the clock ticks down to the suspension of Parliament sometime later tonight, does the Prime Minister have one final card to play?
No wonder Boris Johnson is closing Parliament early. He has lost every single vote in the House of Commons since becoming Prime Minister. Nothing quite like it has ever happened before. This evening he was not in the Commons as the opposition forced a debate on, of all things, whether or not the government should obey the law and delay Brexit if there's no deal.
A law has been passed by this House and by the other place, and the government must abide by it. It's not complicated, it's very, very straightforward and simple.
This government will always respect the rule of law. That's been our clear position consistently, and frankly, it's outrageous that that is even in doubt.
The ayes to the right, 311.
Minutes earlier, the government had been defeated yet again. MPs demanding all correspondence about Parliament's early prorogation. Last week, a note from Boris Johnson himself emerged, showing it had been under discussion earlier than had been admitted. But a Number 10 source said they would ignore the demand to publish, to the dismay of MPs.
And if the rule book gets ripped up, then we will end up with nothing. Our parliamentary democracy will be smashed to pieces.
The government has suggested that it might not provide the information that the House of Commons has just said it must provide. What then?
The government is going to have to make up its mind whether it's just a bunch of hoodlums who are just smashing the place up while they try to achieve a particular end, or whether in fact they're a respectable group who are trying to operate within our constitutional norms.
The Prime Minister had started his day in Dublin with a stern lecture on Brexit from the Irish Taoiseach.
There's no such thing as a clean break or just getting it done. Rather, we'll just move on to a new phase. If there is no deal, it'll cause severe disruption for British and Irish people alike.
And Mr Johnson sounded less bullish than of late on the possibility of a no-deal Brexit.
And yes, of course, we could do it. The UK could certainly get through it. But be in no doubt, that outcome would be a failure of statecraft for which we would all be responsible.
Then, after joining the illustrious names in the visitors' book,
Donald Trump. Goodness.
The two men held an hour of meetings. Despite how late in the day all this is getting, the two sides here said their discussions were at an early stage. They said some common ground had been established, but that significant gaps remain. This evening, the Prime Minister was seen dining here with MPs. Very soon he'll ask them for another election, then Parliament will be prorogued. There are just over 7 weeks until Brexit. For the next 5, Parliament will be powerless, leaving the Prime Minister to make the next move. Carl Dinin News at 10, Westminster.
Well, on a busy day in Parliament, the resignation of the Speaker triggered more than an hour of tributes, and quite right too. His supporters would say he has, as he modestly put it, been the backbenchers' backstop. He said he was stepping down because he'd promised his wife Sally at the last election in 2017 that he would not fight another one. He thanked her with tears in his eyes for her support. He will have a last laugh of sorts, choosing to step down on the Prime Minister's chosen Brexit date. Yep, the 31st of October.
I would like to make a personal statement to the House.
He's seen himself as a protector of Parliament. and John Bercow has picked a departure date to make a point, October the 31st, which after votes he's granted may or may not be Brexit Day.
To deploy a perhaps dangerous phrase, I have also sought to be the backbencher's backstop.
And he had a timely warning, perhaps aimed at a Prime Minister wanting to sideline MPs.
We degrade this Parliament at our peril.
It was an emotional farewell, his decision honouring a promise made to his family.
My wife Sally and our 3 children, Oliver, Freddie and Jemima.
His legacy can be measured by the reaction to his announcement. Opposition parties full of praise, but on the government front bench, ministers stayed silent. He's made as many enemies as friends.
There have been occasions when some in the House have taken umbrage at decisions that you have reached, but you have stood by your beliefs and your principles, and there are many, many members of this House who are eternally grateful to you.
The Prime Minister has finished, and he can take it from me that he's finished. The Prime Minister will please withdraw the word idiot. You need to write out 1,000 times. I will behave myself at Prime Minister's questions.
His barbed put-downs led to accusations of bullying. He repeatedly clashed with ministers over Brexit, his neutrality questioned.
He's mercurial, he could turn on a sixpence. He often lost his temper in the chamber, and ultimately, like many of us, he's a huge ego. And I think he was supposed to be the umpire, but he really wanted to be the opening batsman and the opening bowler at the same time.
For some, John Bercow has revelled in the pomp and exceeded the powers of his position. He leaves behind a parliament divided by Brexit and the decisions he made. Angus Walker, News at 10.
So, the departure of the Speaker is yet another date in what is an already momentous parliamentary diary. MPs leave Westminster tonight for 5 weeks, as we said, as Parliament is suspended, returning for the Queen's speech on the 14th of October, and with at least 25 working days needed before an election. That would take us past the EU summit, past the 19th of October, by which, if no deal is secured, the PM must request a Brexit delay from the EU, in theory at least, and beyond the 31st of October, when, as you have been repeatedly told, we are currently due to leave the EU, as the Prime Minister said we would, come what may, do or die, with the earliest possible date we could be heading to the polls for a general election, therefore, being the week of the 18th of November. It's a little like the build-up to Christmas.
I'm not sure it's quite the same. Isn't this the nightmare before Christmas, Tom? I think.
Yes, anyway, let's not get distracted by that. Look, there is this rumour tonight that the Prime Minister has one last card to play in the course of tonight. True or false, do you think?
I think it may be false. You're right that there has been speculation about this, largely because it doesn't really make much sense that he, he's setting himself up for yet another loss. Frankly, he's already got the propaganda sort of ammunition he needs from last week's refusal by Jeremy Corbyn to back a general election. He can, very happily already say, look, Jeremy Corbyn can't be trusted. He said he wanted an election, and now he is chicken, to use the Prime Minister's phrase. So why does he need to prove that twice? So I'd be surprised, given my conversations with sources inside Number 10, if there were some great ruse. But I think there's a separate point which I would just want to make very briefly, which is this, that by all conventional measures, it's been a terrible time for Boris Johnson, but the opinion polls seem to be showing that he is, if anything, slightly increasing his lead over Labour. And why is that? Because he still has a very simple aim. He's stuck to it, which is to leave, at the end of October, leave the EU at the end of October. And truthfully, the problem that all his opponents have is when you ask them, well, why do you want a delay? They can't really answer it. They haven't got a coherent strategy for what they'll do with that delay yet. Millions of British people are just fed up with the uncertainty.
OK, in a sentence, do you think he will really go as far as to refuse to ask for this extension as the law seems to demand?
Yeah, I'm absolutely certain of it. I mean, I just think that having only got, as I said, this essentially one public important policy, which is to leave on the 31st of October. He simply can't do that. And there are two possibilities. One is he can trigger a no-confidence vote and dare Jeremy Corbyn to take over and then send Jeremy Corbyn over, as it were, where that's successful, to get the delay. Or he can simply defy the law and dare Parliament to, in effect, put him in prison. But truthfully, in terms of what he wants, that is good politics, even if it's, in the process, many people were saying, destroying confidence in our political system.
OK, Robert, thank you very much indeed.
Think of this as Parliament's own lock-in. Once they leave the chamber tonight, all parliamentary business will be suspended and they won't be allowed back in for another 5 weeks. The votes tonight, then, were turbocharged. The Speaker himself announced the date of his own resignation too. But as we come on air, we're expecting the Commons to once again block an early election. Meanwhile, the bill to stop no deal was given royal assent by the Queen today. It is, in other words, now law. Boris Johnson must either ask Europe for a delay to the Brexit date or come up with a deal. He's repeatedly refused to ask for any extension and has committed to uphold the law, which suggests a deal of sorts is now his only option. Today, he confirmed he would overwhelmingly prefer to find an agreement when he met the Irish PM Leo Varadkar in Dublin. We'll be hearing from Ireland shortly and speaking to the former Northern Ireland Secretary and Labour strategist Peter Mandelson. But first, to Nick Watt in Central Lobby. They did cram a lot into this last evening, Nick.
That's right. In the last hour or so, Boris Johnson has lost his 5th out of 5 votes in Parliament as Prime Minister. And in the latest vote, the Prime Minister is going to have to publish all documents related to no-deal planning. And in the other thing, what he's going to have to do is 9 named officials are going to have to release their private correspondence related to the suspension of prorogation of Parliament. And the reason for that is Dominic Grieve, the attorney, the former Attorney General who's pushing for this, he's been told from within Whitehall that the real reason for prorogation was to avoid debating Brexit. It was not mainly the public reason, which is this is the normal course of affairs. Queen speaks to allow a new and a fresh legislative agenda. Now, the view in government to this is we'll see you in court. And Dominic Grieve's response to that, well, if you do that, that sounds like a contempt of Parliament. Now, it may well be that by the end of this evening, or possibly into the early hours, Boris Johnson will have lost 6 out of 6 votes. In the next half an hour or so, he will stand up and make a second call in a week for an early general election. That will be refused by Parliament, but we're told that his speech is going to be punchy.
Nick, what are you hearing tonight about any deal?
Well, we've been hearing a lot about how there could be no deal, but today we've been hearing more about a deal. It was interesting you played those remarks by Boris Johnson earlier on today about how no deal would be a failure of statecraft. Now, I've been talking to a number of Tories, and they're saying, Tories on both sides, they're hearing that the Prime Minister is genuinely determined to get a deal. And what they're hearing is that he would be willing to give Northern Ireland a closer relationship to the EU than the rest of the UK would have. This was originally the EU's idea, known as the Northern Ireland backstop. It would not be called by that, but it would be a different relationship. Now, the key thing is, this would have, in the Prime Minister's view, to be approved by the Northern Ireland executive, which is not sitting at the moment. And but the other key thing is, if this happened, this would allow potentially the Prime Minister to negotiate what they call a Canada Plus style trading relationship with the EU, because that would be for Great Britain, not the UK as a whole. Now, earlier I spoke about these matters to David Liddington. He was Theresa May's former deputy, and he was at the heart of those negotiations on Northern Ireland and the backstop.
There would need then to be a focus on what happens in the border between the single market of the EU and the United Kingdom, which is the Irish land border. It's the only land border between us in the UK and the EU single market once we've left. So you have to think what rules, what regime apply there. And well, I understand the sort of ideas being tossed around now would involve is to say, well, the whole UK benefits from a trade agreement with the EU, but goods or foodstuffs going into Northern Ireland would be subject to some kind of regime that means that the integrity of the European single market is protected in case stuff goes south of the border.
So the way you deal with the border problem in Ireland is have some sort of all-Ireland arrangements for the economy?
It looks that way, but then, as I say, we've got some kind of arrangements with livestock on that at the moment. We'll have to see exactly what comes out of the negotiations. What is important for Northern Ireland, above every other part of the UK, is that we get an orderly departure.
Well, that was David Liddington speaking to Nick Watt. MPs are just about to start debating that early election, and we're expecting to see the Prime Minister on his feet any moment. But we're joined now from Central Lobby by the Shadow Solicitor General, Nick Thomas Simmons. And you'd agree that if the bill, Nick, has been given royal assent now, the one that will block no deal, and the PM has ruled out breaking the law, you can be pretty confident, can't you, at this point, that it won't all end in no deal?
I'm afraid that you can't be confident in anything that Boris Johnson says, unfortunately. And yes, of course, I'm very pleased that that bill has reached the statute book. I mean, we had all kinds of suggestions, even, for example, that somehow a ruse would be found so that royal assent wouldn't be granted. I'm pleased to see that today, but that doesn't change the fact that we've had chaos and a supreme lack of trust in this Prime Minister. Just take the example of no deal, which he said was a 1,000,000 to 1 chance. He then said it was a 50-50 chance. We then heard from Amber Rudd after her resignation that actually she didn't think that there were efforts going on to get a deal at all. So in those circumstances, it's no surprise that we are not trusting what Boris Johnson says, and we want to actually see this now through so that we know there isn't going to be a no-deal exit by some sort of constitutional chicanery from the Prime Minister.
Let me ask you to interpret what he said then in Dublin today, because he told us he overwhelmingly preferred to find a deal. Now, if that deal that he comes back with, without being able to, as we know, reopen the withdrawal agreement, if it is some kind of border down the Irish Sea, a backstop for Northern Ireland only, is that a deal that you, Labour, could support?
Well, we've made clear now that we believe that opinions have hardened so much that any deal does now need to go back to the people. That isn't to say we haven't made efforts, of course, in the past. We spent 6 weeks in talks with the government. I mean, I myself, in the indicative votes process, voted for leaving with the customs union. I voted for leaving with high single market access.
This is a no to supporting it, is it?
I can't see at the moment anything other than the policy that I'm setting out to you, Emily, which is that we feel at this point any such deal now has to go back to the people. What we don't know, of course, we don't have any idea exactly what the Prime Minister is looking to do, because there is a supreme lack of transparency from this government, either about the effect of no deal or indeed the precise nature and contours of the deal it's seeking.
Nick Simmons-Thomas, thanks very much indeed. As you were hearing, the political day began in Dublin. A press conference between Leo Varadkar and Boris Johnson contained home truths from the Irish side and strong claims from our own Prime Minister. Mr Johnson confirming that no deal would be what he called a failure of statecraft, which would be the responsibility of all those who had sired it. So does that mean there is a deal in sight? Will it mean a border in the Irish Sea, confining the backstop, so detested by Brexiteers, to Northern Ireland only? Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is in Dublin and sent his report.
Two countries long bound by common arrangements are now facing the possible stormy waters of a no-deal Brexit. In Dublin Port, there are preparations to treat the Irish Sea as a fully fledged international border. A decision made all the more likely now Boris Johnson has made clear where he'd like to end up, in a relationship less close to the EU than Theresa May wanted.
So the destination of a Canada-style free trade agreement, fine, theoretically, but of course a Canada-style FTA wouldn't solve the border question, so it would necessitate the continued existence of the backstop from the EU point of view, and so it's not a solution.
At Dublin's port, they've assumed the worst and started acting on that assumption 2 years ago, launching a programme of investment to build new customs and inspection facilities. They assumed Britain would be outside the single market and customs union and planned accordingly.
We decided we would take the British government at face value. We're not involved in the political discussions. We decided that we need to prepare here in Dublin Port for the effects of a hard Brexit. The reason we did that was the lead time to provide the infrastructure necessary if there was going to be a hard Brexit. That lead time meant we had to start early, maybe sooner than Ireland generally was thinking about such an eventuality.
But of course the port can plan and build infrastructure, doing precisely what both governments have pledged not to do on the Northern Ireland land border. This morning, Boris Johnson came here trying to convince the Irish government that the British government has answers to the challenges and that they're negotiating in earnest.
I want to get a deal. Like you, I've looked carefully at no deal. I've assessed its consequences both for our country and yours. And yes, of course, we could do it. The UK could certainly get through it, but be in no doubt that outcome would be a failure of statecraft for which we would all be responsible.
His host, though, wanted to make clear that leaving the EU without a deal was no solution at all.
And whatever happens, we'll have to get back to the negotiating table quite quickly. And when we do, the first items on the agenda will be citizens' rights, the financial settlement and the Irish border.
Their talks were described as cordial, but nobody doubts that Mr Johnson has reached the time for hard political choices.
Well, there's no denying that Boris Johnson wants to make progress on this visit, but also that he's very limited in his political room for manoeuvre. And really he's only got one of two ways he can go. In terms of the alternative arrangements, trying to separate out the hard border issues and make them more palatable, or to have a border on the Irish Sea, which of course would bring him into conflict with the DUP in the north, and could only really be resolved by him winning a thumping Conservative majority in a new election and not needing the DUP anymore.
The DUP leader reminded us today that Mr Johnson has previously said he opposes a Northern Ireland-only backstop. From the Republic's perspective, though, keeping Northern Ireland bound into EU regulations and tariffs is now looking like the only viable option.
I think the expectation on this side of the Irish Sea is that if there is to be a deal, it'll be very much based around a Northern Ireland only backstop. That already was deemed acceptable to the EU and to the Irish government back in December 2017. It was the original solution which Theresa May had on the table, but then obviously it was rejected by the DUP and others, it has to be said, from the unionist community in Northern Ireland. So I think that if there is optimism, it's based on that, but obviously there's no guarantee that that can be an outcome between now and the 31st of October.
The new infrastructure for inspecting goods arriving from Britain is now in place in Dublin Port, and it's already being used. And it's precisely because such facilities cannot be replicated on the land border that Northern Ireland may end up permanently in the backstop, even if the rest of the UK doesn't.
That was Mark Urban, and joining us now is the MEP and leader of Northern Ireland's Alliance Party, Naomi Long. In a moment, we'll be speaking to the DUP's Westminster leader, Nigel Dodds. Does that sound like an acceptable solution to something that has felt intractable for 3 years, Naomi?
Well, I'm not sure that it's a solution that will get through Parliament. I think that's the first thing, and that will be the major challenge that the Prime Minister would face.
The Alliance?
Well, in terms of Alliance, we have said from the beginning that we would prefer that there was no Brexit happening at all. That is our fundamental position. There's no sensible Brexit. If it's going to happen, then at all costs we have to avoid a hard Brexit without a deal, because that would be catastrophic in terms of Northern Ireland business and society. And it would also create major problems in terms of the Good Friday Agreement. So we're very clear that we need a deal. We Also, we're very clear we would prefer it was an all-UK deal, because I think that answers some of the concerns that unionists have. But if the Northern Ireland backstop is the only option left, then it is the least worst option available. However, I am yet to be convinced that the Prime Minister is serious about getting a deal. I think he simply is in a phase of apportioning blame for Brexit and for what will come after Brexit.
Do you think that the people of Northern Ireland, we know that the majority there voted to remain, would they find that acceptable? They get their customs union, they get their single market, they stay in with...
There is no question when you talk to farmers, when you talk to the business community, when you talk to trade unions, when you talk to civil society in Northern Ireland, that all of them believe that special arrangements for Northern Ireland are required because of our unique politics and because of our unique situation with a land border. I think people in civic society accept that. It's something that the DUP haven't accepted. I can't see them accepting it now when they didn't accept it when Theresa May floated it originally. And it was for that reason that the EU were flexible and allowed it to be expanded to the rest of the UK. Look, we firmly believe that Northern Ireland exiting without a deal, I mean, Brexit is a challenge for the whole of the UK.
Okay.
But for Northern Ireland, it is an existential challenge. And we've got to find a solution quickly. I have no confidence in the current Prime Minister's commitment to doing that. But I do believe in what he said today around statecraft, the failure of statecraft on all our parts, is again another indication that what he wants to do is transfer blame to Dublin, to the EU, and ultimately to Parliament for the failure to agree a deal. Because the consequences of no deal are so significant and so negative.
Naomi Long, thanks very much. We haven't got the government with us this evening. We're trying to piece together what we are hearing. Nigel Dodds joins us from the Commons. And by all accounts, Nigel Dodds, you were chatting to the PM in the MP's dining room tonight. Did he share his thoughts with you, and did he suggest this might be his current thinking?
Well, we talk to the Prime Minister and senior members of the government all the time, and we remain in close touch with them. Indeed, I would say that we have had as many meetings with the new Prime Minister as we had with the previous Prime Minister during her tenure, and his is considerably shorter, although we had many meetings with Theresa May as well. So we're quite relaxed about the way things are going. We think that Boris Johnson knows what he's about. He wants to do a deal. I'm convinced of that, and I was glad to hear the constructive dialogue today in Dublin.
Would you be relaxed if that deal came back as some kind of border arrangement in the Irish Sea? In other words, Northern Ireland stays in the backstop.
Well, let's deal with all of that. First of all, the original Northern Ireland only backstop was, of course, a suggestion from Michel Barnier and the European Commission, rejected by Theresa May and by Jeremy Corbyn, in the words, no British Prime Minister could ever accept such a solution. Why? Because it separates Northern Ireland in terms of the UK single market, and we sell and trade with the rest of the United Kingdom 3/4 of all our goods. And it would also cause a breach of the Good Friday Agreement. And remember, Boris Johnson, it's because he relies on the votes of the DUP. He recognised in the letter to Donald Tusk in August.
Anymore. He probably doesn't anymore. Well, I mean, he could cut you adrift in the way he's got his own MPs adrift, quite frankly.
Whatever about the votes, the fact of the matter is that the principles of the Belfast Agreement are very, very clear. And Boris Johnson and all the parties recognise that you can't have a situation where, in order to avoid some hard border in the island of Ireland, which pleases nationalists, that you then create borders down the Irish Sea to the detriment of unionists. That's why that's a very fundamental point which the government has accepted.
You're saying that's a breach of the Good Friday Agreement, because Naomi Long said it would not be a breach of the Good Friday Agreement. It wouldn't be ideal, but it would be the best possible scenario at this point.
Of course she argues that, but the government doesn't agree with that. Unionists don't agree with that. The overwhelming number of whom say that we want to avoid a hard border in Ireland. Indeed, Leo Varadkar has made it clear recently that in his plans for a no-deal Brexit, there wouldn't be any hard border in the island of Ireland.
So if he comes back to you and says, sorry, you know, we've heard the DUP, but quite frankly, we have to let you go. You've had your money. Yeah, you didn't show any confidence or supply to Theresa May anyway.
Oh, we did. I mean, don't be now making falsehoods. I know the BBC have a particular view, but that's a falsehood. We did support the government throughout many votes.
Well, you didn't back a deal.
No. Let's be accurate now. Let's not spread falsehoods. The DUP supported the government much more often than many of our own MPs. But on Brexit, where we had an agreement that we progress on the basis of shared values, namely the integrity of the United Kingdom, Theresa May departed from that, and that's why she went down to not just the DUP opposing her, but the half of her parliamentary party. So let's be accurate in this, and let's not rewrite history.
I'm just asking for your response now. If this is Boris Johnson's only deal, if this is the only way left to him, because he won't ask for an extension and he won't break the law, what would you say to the Prime Minister?
We're very clear. We're very clear that we agree with what Boris Johnson put in his letter to Donald Tusk. The backstop is anti-democratic. It means that nobody in Stormont or London would have any say over large swathes of the economic laws that would apply in Northern Ireland. He has rejected that. He also accepts our position that it's contrary to the provisions of the Belfast Agreement. He's accepted that. So I don't expect Boris Johnson to do anything of the sort. There may be some areas where in certain areas of the economy where it's to the benefit of Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom and the Irish Republic and the rest of the EU to have arrangements. But that would have to be subject to the provisions of paragraph 50 of the joint proposal, which we inserted, which is that the consent of the Northern Ireland Assembly, Unionists and Nationalists, would have to apply. So if all of that applies, then that is fine.
Nigel Dodds, thanks very much indeed. We're joined now by Rory Stewart, the former International Development Secretary, who now sits as an independent MP. And in a moment, I'll be joined by the Tory backbencher Andrew Bridgen. The PM said categorically today that it would be a failure of statesmanship to not get a deal. Do you believe him, Rory, when he says that?
I believe that he thinks it would be a failure of statesmanship not to get a deal. But remember, he is still, and this, of course, is the disagreement between myself and him, open to going with no deal by the 31st of October if he can't get a deal in place. So I think that the difference is this, that firstly, that he's still very much leaving no deal on the table, not just as a negotiating tool, but it's something that he would do if he didn't get a deal. And secondly, he thinks he can get a quite different deal from the withdrawal agreement. And that's where we disagree. I think if we're going to take a deal through, it would have to essentially be the withdrawal agreement.
The reason that we're talking about the Northern Ireland border, or rather the Irish Sea border tonight, is because that would be the one area where the EU could grant a deal very easily, and he might decide that that was the only option available to him. That would be a Canada Plus style deal for the UK or for Great Britain, and it would leave Northern Ireland in the customs union separated by that sea border. Would that be an acceptable deal?
Yes, I mean, both those deals, these are just variations on what's been discussed with Brussels by Theresa May. But they both have the same thing in common, which is not putting a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, allowing Northern Ireland and the Republic to be effectively in a customs union, or in that case also in a single market.
So when you say yes, that would be something you could say. You signed up to Theresa May's withdrawal agreement.
I'm hugely enthusiastic for Theresa May's withdrawal agreement. It seemed like a very, very good deal. I think it's a better deal than what you're currently talking about. But above all, I believe in compromise. I don't think that we can be stuck for the next 40 years with half the people pushing for no deal and half the people pushing for Remain. I believe in what I suppose is called a soft Brexit, and a compromise around a customs union, which is something I voted for, or the withdrawal agreement. But I think Theresa May's view, which is the whole of the United Kingdom in that customs arrangement, would be preferable to just Northern Ireland being on its own.
I just want to stick with the potential this deal has.
Sure.
He kicked you lot out, 20 of the Rebel Alliance. Do you think he'd throw the DUP under the bus, or do you think he would, you've just heard Nigel Dodds, would he honour and respect the pledge he made to them to keep the United Kingdom together?
Well, honestly, I think it's very surprising. It's very interesting news, but I think it would be very surprising if he chose to go with what you're talking about, Northern Ireland backstop, because, as you say, he has explicitly rejected Theresa May's deal because he didn't like the much more minor divisions between Northern Ireland and Great Britain that would have happened in her deal. This would be a much bigger difference.
So if you don't think that is the way it's going to end up, where do you think it's going to end up?
I hope that we're going to come back to a moderate compromise around the existing withdrawal agreement. That's the only deal negotiated, hundreds of pages of long with Brussels. I think it was a calamitous mistake to reject it. And the reason for it isn't just the merits of the deal, it's that we need a compromise to bring this country together again, so we're not stuck in division for the next 40 years.
He loses the ERG, as you know, if he does that.
But just to be clear, I mean, if the Prime Minister were to get a deal, I would be the first to apologise. I've said consistently for months that I don't think he can get a deal. If I'm wrong, all credit and honour to him, and I would go down on bended knees in front of him and apologise. We need a deal to get through this.
And would you then fight the next election? Would you stay in your seat? Would you take on a London seat?
No, I would try to stay in my seat and fight it as a Conservative. I'm a Conservative. although we disagree, I think a no-deal Brexit
Sure,
is very
but
damaging
where?
to my farmers.
Is that going to be Penrith, or would you want somewhere where you felt that there was more chance of winning a seat?
If I was lucky enough to get the Conservative whip back, I would fight in Penrith on the border. It's my seat. Been there for 10 years. I love it. And I would feel that I'd done something particularly for farmers in Cumbria by stopping a no-deal Brexit.
Roy Stewart, thanks very much. Let's go to Andrew Bridgen from the ERG, who joins us from the Commons. Your Prime Minister wants a deal. Do you, Andrew?
Yes, I'd love to have a super Canada free trade deal with mutual acceptance of standards. We're going to be a much bigger market than Canada, potentially. 17% of all EU exports would come to us. We've got full regulatory equivalence at the moment. That's the deal I'd like.
So Super Canada, just to spell this out, would put that border in the Irish Sea, something that the DUP have rejected. No, you're shaking your head. Why?
Well, if we think back, before the Irish border became a stick with which to beat the UK during these negotiations, there was a joint declaration by HMRC Northern Ireland and Customs and Excise south of the border, which said that the current infrastructure on the border was quite sufficient for all eventualities of Brexit, including what we now call no-deal WTO Brexit.
That was 3 years ago. Nobody's come up with the alternative arrangement. So that's why I put to you that the sea is the only border that actually exists at the moment.
There's lots of alternative arrangements around trusted trader schemes, exemptions for small traders. There's going to be no hard border on the island of Ireland. There are probably 300 border crossings between the north and south of Ireland. That's more border crossings than the whole eastern border of the European Union itself.
Why do you think, then, everyone in the EU has said we welcome all sorts of creative thinking? Angela Merkel's talked about 30 days to come up with more deals, and that hasn't resulted in any new vision or new possibilities. That's why I put to you, if the deal came back and it was about a border down the Irish Sea, would you, with the ERG, would you be able to accept that? Would you vote for it in the Commons?
I don't think so. I think it would be, as Nigel Dodd said, in breach of the Good Friday Agreement. But let's make clear, the big fear for the European Union is Brexit contagion. And the last thing they want are people in the Republic of Ireland looking over into a land of milk and honey in the north, where we've probably got a free trade agreement with the US, who are actually the Republic of Ireland's largest trading partner, that they can't get involved in because they're in the European Union. That's why they're desperate to carve Northern Ireland away from the UK. As far as I'm concerned, we had a poll of the whole of the United Kingdom back in 2016. We voted to leave. The whole of the United Kingdom should leave.
Andrew Bridgen, thanks very much. Well, the debate about an early election has just begun. The Prime Minister kicked off that debate a few moments ago. Let's just listen into what he said.
Last Wednesday, the Right Honourable Member for Islington North became the first leader of the opposition in the history of our country to show his confidence in Her Majesty's government by declining the opportunity to have an election with a view to removing the government. Why are they conniving to delay Brexit in defiance of the referendum, costing the country an extra £250 million a week for the privilege, £250 million a week for the privilege of delay, enough to upgrade more than 5 hospitals and train 4,000 new nurses? The only possible explanation is that they fear that we will win it, Mr. Speaker. I will win it and secure a renewed mandate to take this country out of the EU, a policy they now oppose. And that is the sorry tale of this opposition in this Parliament.
That was the Prime Minister speaking a few moments ago. Joining us now, the Labour peer, former Northern Ireland Secretary and election strategist of the Blair years, Peter Mandelson. I wonder how you read the runes tonight. What do you think is going on?
Well, start with the Prime Minister's position. He's lost his majority in the House of Commons and he's now shutting down Parliament. He's lost all his attempts to call a general election. He's had a law imposed on him which will prevent him from taking Britain out of the European Union without a deal. Now, here's one of two reactions to that. He can either sit tight, retreat into Downing Street, where he's happily boxed in like a squatter Prime Minister, you know, shouting from the rooftops that the world is unfair and it's everyone else's fault but his. or he can do the statesmanlike thing, and that is go out and get a deal and help the nation get out of this terrible political crisis. I don't know which way he's going to go. I'm sure that if he were listening to Dominic Cummings, he would say, take them on, keep polarising, keep whipping up opinion, keep dividing the nation. You know, we've got everything to play for. That wouldn't be the sensible thing to do. It wouldn't be in the interest of the country. It wouldn't be in the interest of the Conservative Party either. I hope the Prime Minister will get up off his backside and work very hard for a deal. I couldn't tell you with any degree of certainty that that's what he's going to do.
You might understand the mindset of a Dominic Cummings, an election strategist, more than most. You were once seen very much in that role as the sort of mastermind of how to get things done, how to win. Is there a chance that this plan is working, that he has got people where he wants, that he then does bring back a deal of sorts, and everyone's so relieved it's not deal that they all sign up to it?
He hasn't got the nation behind him.
How do you know?
Well, because I read every single opinion poll which demonstrates that he hasn't got the nation behind him. What he has succeeded in doing, and this I think is Dominic Cummings' plan, is to consolidate very, very tightly and strongly his support on the Leave supporting half of the nation. And it's a bit like Donald Trump. Donald Trump doesn't appeal to the whole of the United States. He appeals to his base. And that's exactly what I think Boris Johnson has been driven into doing himself. I don't, however, think that that is going to get him out of the hole that he's dug himself into.
But it is enough to win,
isn't it? He needs broader support, both within the country and in particular in the House of Commons. And I don't think he's going to get that support and be able to build that consensus that he needs for a deal, if that's what he's going to seek, without the support of all those 280, 300 members of Parliament who want to see any deal ratified by the public. They want to see it legitimised, validated in a final say public vote. And without the support of those MPs who support that opinion, I don't think he's going to get it through the House of Commons.
But that's why he wants to change the makeup. You know that you're being portrayed...
But he's not going to be able to do that, is he?
Well, eventually he will.
MPs by force measure?
And peers are being portrayed right now as out of touch. You know, you've heard it's Parliament versus the people. You might not believe this, but you still have to cut through. You have to prove that he is not just the only one speaking to the people.
They're out of touch with his side of public opinion in the country. You know, of course he wants to sort of present this as, you know, Parliament versus the people, and he's the champion of the people against Parliament. You know, again and again I hear on the BBC, you know, the people, the public described as if they are all of one view. They're not. The country is split down the middle. And if the first Mrs May and now Boris Johnson, rather than trying to sort of push through a winner-takes-all result of the referendum, and instead try to reconcile the 52 and the 48 and found a more consensual way of implementing Brexit, we'd have been out of the European Union by now.
You would probably have found a solution if the Labour Party itself had a consensus about Jeremy Corbyn. Do you believe that Labour is a party of Remain now, that Jeremy Corbyn himself would campaign for Remain? You know that Dominic Cummings is targeting Leave seats in the north of England, which will be very complicated for Labour now.
Yes, but most Leave seats in the Midlands and the north of England, indeed throughout the country, had a majority of Labour voters. Not all, about 30 didn't, but most had a majority of Labour voters who supported Remain in the referendum. Of course, those votes, plus Conservatives and UKIP and whatever, produced a majority in those seats for Leave.
Leave seats had voted Remain?
No, Labour voters, in the overwhelming majority
Leave
of them,
seats in the north that were Labour.
including in the north, the majority of Labour voters supported Remain. The Leave constituencies as a whole, because they were joined with Conservatives and UKIP, you know, voted a majority Leave, but not the Labour vote. Now, this is a dilemma for Jeremy Corbyn. I fully accept that. But, you know, if Jeremy is going to continue saying, you know, on the one hand this and on the one hand that, I'm the man in the middle and I can see both sides, so everyone should agree with me, I'm afraid that sort of equivocation, is way out of date. Given that Boris Johnson has so consolidated his support amongst the Leave-leaning side of the country, Jeremy Corbyn has absolutely no option in a general election, because he's certainly not going to be able to bracket off Brexit from everything else. He has no option, I'm afraid, but to plant his flag very firmly on the Remain side of the argument. That's where the Labour Party's heart is, that's where its values, that's where its idealism is. If he were to drive opposition to that, I'm afraid he would just be simply run over in the middle of the road.
Peter Mallison, thank you very much. We're going to take a look at tomorrow's front page as The Guardian has a picture of the Speaker who will stand down the 31st of October. Johnson's told to hand over secret no-deal Brexit plans is the vote that forces those papers to be released. And the Lib Dem leader has vowed to revoke Article 50, which would end the chance of an alliance with Labour at a forthcoming general election. That same picture is in the Daily Telegraph. The Speaker aims to have the last word on his successor. He's going to try to ensure Remainer Commons chooses his replacement, i.e. Quitting before the election decides that. And the Daily Mirror has the honours list outrage. It says, no shame, a picture of Theresa May. Parliament suspended over the Brexit crisis. Theresa May has the audacity to reward the bungling advisers who got us into this mess, including many of the people who helped her with the last election, the 2017 election. We'll talk through some of tomorrow's comments pieces right now with Rachel Sylvester from The Times. And you can probably spill the beans on the honours list, Rachel. But talk to us, first of all, about your own piece. Boris Johnson's recklessness is not an electoral asset. This is the question, isn't it? It's whether that whole phrasing of Parliament versus the people will work, will have an impact, will actually help him at the ballot box.
And the whole point of Boris Johnson, the reason he was elected as Tory leader was because he was seen as a winner. And he's desperate to turn the election campaign into a contest between him and Jeremy Corbyn, a head-to-head. But what I think is really fascinating is the balance of risk has changed between the two leaders since Boris Johnson moved into Downing Street. And now he's the one pursuing this incredibly economically risky path of the no-deal Brexit. He's putting security at risk. He's the one having an absolute purge of MPs, much more than Jeremy Corbyn ever has. In fact, it's the revolutionaries are now in Downing Street under the Conservatives, and Jeremy Corbyn's starting to look this rather sort of...
Do you think he still feels in charge? Is this what he was anticipating and expecting, or do you think it's run away without him?
No, I think he's completely lost control of events. I think he made a major miscalculation about what Labour would do on the general election. And I think he also overplayed his hand by making these announcements on proroguing Parliament, and he created a sense of unity among his opponents, which they'd been lacking.
Let's just skate through Michael Deacon's piece. This is The Telegraph. John Bercow may be going, but he's trolling Tory Brexiteers to the end with his usual Dickensian orotundity. Mr Bercow claimed he'd chosen that date so they had an experienced figure in charge. He wants to try and make sure that the Remainer Parliament chooses his replacement.
And Michael Deacon's piece brilliantly captures the sense of MPs standing up one after the other to praise the Speaker. But of course, he's been this deeply divisive figure, and Brexiteers see him as a Remainer who's setting out to thwart the true Brexit. Remainers see him as a champion of democracy. And of course, he's had the last laugh in saying he'll leave on the 31st of October so that the current MPs choose a successor.
Rachel, great to see you. Thank you very much.